Welcome back to our DAN Education series, in which we talk about issues of the heart, health and diving. We're in Chapter 6, Part 3, and in this session we'll be talking about a condition called immersion pulmonary edema. Keep watching. Immersion pulmonary edema is a form of edema that is the result of an accumulation of fluid in the tissues of the lungs that specifically affects divers and swimmers. Immersion at depth is the key because immersion itself takes away the effect of gravity, which lets blood pool in the lower extremities, and shifts it centrally, where it now can overload the circulation around the lungs and heart, and specifically in the lungs, where it can then result in leakage or edema. And that is one of the aspects that needs to be understood and an element of the diving milieu. Now, one of the reasons why this happens to divers is that the process of breathing gas at depth requires effort and actually generates a somewhat negative pressure relative in the chest during breathing effort. This and a combination of other factors that we'll elucidate in a moment predisposes an individual to the collection of fluid in the lungs. And this is even worse if there is cold or panic or exertion. Now, maintaining proper fluid balance in lung tissue and its blood vessels requires a dynamic combination of various opposing forces. Unopposed changes in any of these forces can result in a buildup of excess fluid or edema in the pulmonary tissue. The main variables involved in regulating the fluid balance are as follows. Oncotic pressure, which, if you like, is a form of proteinaceous or cellular suction in blood vessels that tends to draw fluid into the circulation. Oncotic pressure, or the leakage of proteins into the tissues of the lungs, which will again attract fluid or draw fluid into the lungs. The permeability or the leakiness of the pulmonary capillaries. Hydrostatic pressure, which is the blood pressure, if you like, inside the capillaries that will force fluid out. And the hydraulic pressure that essentially drives fluid through the lungs. Add to that the pressure that is in the alveoli, or the tiny air sacs of the lungs, and you have a variety of factors, all of which may be affected during diving. These factors are collectively known as Starling forces, and they can actually be quantified and placed in an equation that would allow you to calculate the net or differential forces. Now, pulmonary edema is caused when there's a change in these forces, such as a drop in the levels of key proteins in the blood, or leakage from pulmonary capillaries due to sepsis, which is a life-threatening complication resulting from infections, or if there's an increase in hydrostatic pressure in the pulmonary capillaries due to cardiac failure, and negative pressure in the alveoli due to resistance from breathing through a faulty regulator. Additional issues that can contribute to the development of pulmonary edema include some of the effects of cardiovascular drugs or medication, acute respiratory distress syndrome, the life-threatening septic condition we mentioned, or one that may be the result of toxic exposure to oxygen breathing over a prolonged period of time. reperfusion, which means the restoration of circulation after a heart attack or stroke, cardiomyopathy, which is a weakening of heart muscles, and high altitude pulmonary edema, in other words, being exposed to climbing a mountain and, as a result, predisposing the individual to subsequent leakage. And of course, pulmonary embolus, a blood clot lodged in a blood vessel in the lung. Then there's re-expansion or reinflation of a collapsed lung if there was a pneumothorax, pulmonary hypertension, which is elevated pressure in the arteries that carry blood from the heart to the lungs, conditions like lung cancer, bleeding within the lungs, and some disorders of the nervous system that also make the blood vessels in the lung more leaky. Other factors may include overhydration, even by well-intentioned divers who've heard the conventional wisdom that dehydration is a risk factor for decompression sickness. That's true, but too much of a good thing can actually cause complications. And then there's poor physical conditioning, which can result in increased negative pressure in the alveoli during deep inspiration. Now, the symptoms of emergent pulmonary edema include chest discomfort or pain, dyspnea or difficulty breathing, wheezing, and pink frothy sputum when submerged or shortly after emerging from the water. Most people who suffer an episode of emergent pulmonary edema had no significant history or signs that would indicate that they were susceptible to the condition. It can happen in healthy athletes, for instance. And the risk of emergent pulmonary edema does rise with age, but is not only the result of age. Additional risk factors might be obesity and elevated blood pressure. Once pulmonary edema occurs, hypoxia or lack of oxygen leads to a constriction of pulmonary blood vessels, which worsens the cascade of ill effects. And the situation can be further aggravated by accompanying dyspnea, in which the person in a panicked situation tries to breathe even harder at depth and thereby creates an even greater negative pressure differential. And it can even result in near drowning, even though the person's essentially drowning in their own fluids. Other conditions that may resemble emergent pulmonary edema are near drowning and, of course, pulmonary decompression sickness or pulmonary overinflation syndrome. In other words, where during ascent there's a certain amount of breath holding and the lungs overexpand. So it's important to keep in mind that emergent pulmonary edema's onset can occur either at depth or manifest upon reaching the surface. And it's not necessarily precipitated by aggressive diving, a rapid ascent, or aspiration of water. Treatment for emergent pulmonary edema should begin with removal of the affected individual from the water, which is to relieve the compression on the vessels in the lower extremities, allowing the centrally pooled fluids to return to the extremities. So it essentially takes away the fluid that was leaking into the lungs, with the administration of oxygen, which makes it easier to breathe and also relieves the pulmonary vasoconstriction to some extent or the effects thereof. In certain situations, diuretics such as Lasix may be added to remove excess intravascular fluid. Although diuresis, which is the body's natural elimination of fluid, may already be underway as a result of hormonal influences. The condition usually resolves quickly in a healthy diver, and prolonged hospitalization is rarely necessary. If it is necessary, it's usually due to the contributing factors such as underlying cardiac problems. So now let's look at the effect on diving. Some divers have a single episode of immersion pulmonary edema and never have the condition again, but repeated episodes are likely. Any individual who has suffered a first episode of immersion pulmonary edema is advised to undergo detailed examination to rule out other medical conditions that may have caused the edema, and to have thorough discussions with their physician regarding the risks of continuing diving. And of course, all divers are urged to regularly maintain their regulators and refrain from overhydration, to attend to proper dive planning to avoid unnecessary exertion and panic, as well as to keep the conditions such as obesity and hypertension under control. We hope that you found this a stimulating episode and would be more aware of the effects of immersion on our lungs. Until next time, safe diving.